Hello class, welcome back to our second video lecture here on Unit 4 in photosynthesis. We're going to begin today's lecture talking about the classification of organisms. And all organisms on Earth are going to fall into one of two categories, either autotrophs or heterotrophs. Alright, if we look at the last portion of each of these two terms, troph, that means to feed. So how are these two types of organisms feeding and getting their own energy? So if we begin with autotrophs, these are going to be organisms that can produce their own food from either inorganic or organic substances, such as water or carbon dioxide. Remember what organic means from the beginning of the year. You have to have both carbon and hydrogen. So autotrophs can take molecules like CO2 and H2O, water, to produce their own food, such as glucose. Now, autotrophs can actually be broken down into two smaller categories, which we call photoautotrophs and chemoautotrophs. For photosynthesis, we're focusing on photoautotrophs, which are organisms that use light energy to create their own food. Chemoautotrophs would be things like ancient bacteria that we call archaebacteria that you could find near the volcanic vents at the bottom of the ocean. There's no light down here, so what they do is the bacteria will actually take minerals or other inorganic substances that are coming out of the superheated water from an underground volcano or vent, and they'll use the electrons from those minerals to create their own hydrogen ion gradient that they later use to make their own glucose and food. But again, our focus this unit is on the photoautotrophs. You and I are heterotrophs. Hetero meaning different. So we consume multiple different types of materials to get our own energy. Proteins, fats, sugar, you name it. That provides us with the energy that we need to sustain our bodies. So again, just remember the differences between autotrophs and heterotrophs, in particular photoautotrophs. Now, I want to revisit the equation for photosynthesis again, real quick. We did this again in our first lecture video, but I just want to examine it a little bit more closely. Again, the goal in photosynthesis is to use light energy in order to reduce carbon dioxide, which means add electrons, and oxidize water to get these two products over here. 1 molecule of glucose and 6 molecules of oxygen, which is the waste product in this reaction. So again, anything on the left-hand side of a formula, don't forget, that's what we call the reactants. And anything on the right-hand side, we call the products. Light energy is not really a molecule. Whoops, go back to the last slide. It's not behaving right now. All right, light is not a molecule. So most times you don't really write it as plus light. You would write the energy form needed for this reaction above the arrow. So if I were to ask you to write this out, either way you could see here is fine. All right, as long as you know that it is needed in order to produce our products here on this side. All right, now, we need light energy, right? So what is light? Light is one of many forms of energy that we find along what is referred to as the electromagnetic spectrum, which is all possible forms of energy or radiation that are currently known to humans. There could be other ones in the universe that we haven't been able to detect yet, but as of now, the forms of energy that we know exist in the universe are what you see below. Radio waves, microwaves, infrared, the visible light spectrum, which is what you and I actually are able to see, ultraviolet, X-rays, and gamma rays. Now, energy, or any of these forms of energy, are really just radiation. And radiation are waves, like you see here. All right? And we call this a wavelength. So the distance between two peaks of energy is wavelength. The greater the distance between the waves of energy doesn't mean actually it's strong, it actually means it's weaker. So the shorter the wavelength, or closer these two peaks are to each other, the stronger or greater the form of the energy. So the weakest of all energy forms are actually radio waves. See how far away the peaks are from each other? But as the peaks start to get closer and closer and closer and closer and closer to each other, that means you're just getting hit more frequently by one wave of energy after the other, with gamma rays being the strongest form of energy that we know of that exists in nature. If you look at the diagram here, the distance between two peaks of energy for gamma rays is about the size of an atom's nucleus, while the distance between radio waves is the height of skyscrapers. It's insane, right? So that's why if you're driving in your car and after, let's say, you're moving away from Philadelphia and about 40 minutes away driving on the turnpike, your radio starts to go all, you start to get the static. Well, this energy, which is really weak, is starting to get reflected by mountains, trees, even clouds, right, which can refract and break apart these weak waves of energy, so you start to lose that current radio station that you're on. Gamma rays, well, they can pretty much penetrate and go right through the earth. They're so powerful. All right, so there's definitely a difference between these two extremes here. We fall right in the middle, what we see and what plants use, and that's the visible light spectrum. The visible light spectrum is broken down into 6 key colors, and we're going to memorize those based on what we say as Roy GBV. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and violet. Yes, there is another color mixed in there, indigo, but that's not really going to be used too much by plants. We can't really perceive the difference too much between indigo and violet, so I'm leaving that one out. But on the spectrum of wavelength you see up here, we have some numbers here, 700 going down to 400. This is wavelength. So the higher number does not mean, again, stronger energy. That would actually mean weaker, because there's a greater distance between wavelengths that you see down here. All right, see how the waves of between the red coloration are a little bit further away than the violet one down here? Because red is actually a weaker form of energy in the visible light spectrum, with the strongest form of, or wavelength of energy in the visible light spectrum being violet. Now, when you see white light, what you're actually seeing, so if you stare at a light bulb, what you're seeing is all 6 of these colors at the same time. So when you see all 6 at the same time, you perceive white in your eye. But if you're to pass white light through a prism like you see here, you can actually start to separate those wavelengths based on how much energy they possess. The weakest forms of light will be separated first, so you see red at the top. The ones that are the strongest, violet, get separated last. So after it rains in the summer and you see a rainbow, what you're actually seeing is the moisture that's in the air is acting as a prism that is separating the white light that is now going through them, and you see the rainbow start to come down to the ground, and you go looking for that pot of gold. So why do you see certain colors then? Black is the absence of color, right? It happens to be one of my favorite colors, but in fact, it's not really a color. It represents nothing. So if you see black, that means no colors are being reflected back to your eye, and you see nothing. It's just an empty void. If you see white, all the colors of the visible light spectrum bounce off that surface and reflect right back to your eye. So my whiteboard in my classroom, the projector will throw light onto that board and reflect colors back to your eye. If you just see white, that means all the colors in the light are being reflected back to your eye at the same time. If you see a specific color like this, green right here, white light will hit that material, and it will absorb all colors except for green. Green gets reflected back to your eye, and you see green. So that's why you're seeing certain colors. Now, plants, the majority of plants out there are obviously green, or some shade of green. All right, the reason why is plants stink at absorbing green light, and yellow kind of too. So that's why you see different shades of green. All right, if you're seeing a really dark green, you're seeing mainly green being reflected back to your eye. If you're seeing a light green, you're probably seeing green and a little bit of yellow also being reflected back to your eye. So of those colors in white light, All right, Roy GBV. Plants are not very good at absorbing green or any of it, so it gets reflected back to your eyeball. So that brings us to pigments. All right, and what are they? Pigments are proteins that are going to absorb certain wavelengths of the visible light spectrum we just discussed. Again, proteins have a very specific structure, and remember, structure dictates function. So based on their molecular structure, they'll be good at absorbing certain wavelengths of light, and others they're not. So pigments will reflect the colors of the visible light spectrum that they cannot absorb, just like I mentioned on the previous slide. So here's white light over here, striking this leaf. It's absorbing everything but green and yellow, so you have this nice light kind of greenish tinge here, and you can see a little yellow mixed in. All right, again, here's some broccoli, mainly just reflecting green back to your eye. So all plants are going to have one major type of plant pigment, and that's called chlorophyll, or at least that's the class of pigment. And there are two versions of chlorophyll that all plants have, chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. Again, you can see down here, here's the two chemical structures. If you take a look at them, do you see any differences? Not many, right? Mainly, here's your big difference. This section here versus this. That little bit dictates what types of energy they can and cannot absorb. Chlorophyll A has the ability to absorb blue and violet from one end of the spectrum and red on the other, and it's going to reflect green. Chlorophyll B absorbs blue and red, can't really get the violet section, and it can reflect both green and yellow, which again is why you're seeing plants as some shade of green. Plants also have some additional, what we call accessory pigments. So these are pigments besides chlorophyll A and B. And they are present in leaves to help absorb the color green. Because plants don't want to waste, if they can help it, that spectrum, that wavelength of light, and don't put it completely to waste. So chlorophyll A and B, you can see right here, they're absorbing down here in the blue, the violet spectrum. And over here also, here's some peaks of them absorbing here in the red. So these are absorption peaks. But in the middle here, particularly around green to yellow, you see nothing. It's flat, right? They're not absorbing anything. But if you throw in some accessory pigments, such as something called a carotenoid, they are absorbing. So this higher peak here, if I come down, I can see I'm in the green area of the wavelength of light. They are absorbing green. So we're not completely wasting, if you're a plant, that green light spectrum. All right, so accessory pigments, such as one here in particular called a carotenoid, they are really good at absorbing green light. If you look at some leaves here, again, we have a green leaf, which is what we see for the majority of the summer and spring. But come fall, what we saw recently, leaves start to change color. They go away from green to colors such as yellow, orange, and kind of like a magenta reddish coloration right here. All right, because what you're starting to see is a variety of other different accessory pigments that all absorb green light. But once chlorophyll starts to disappear come fall, all right, because chlorophyll levels start to decline, the plant stops making them. As they stop making chlorophyll, you see less and less green being reflected back to your eye. Now you start to see these accessory pigments that were always there in the background just getting washed out by the green. Here they still are, absorbing green light, but reflecting these colors that chlorophyll is pretty good at actually absorbing on its own. So that's why come fall we see this beautiful color display until all the pigments actually die out and eventually the leaves just turn brown, start to crumble, and fall off the tree. Alright, so I'm going to give you a homework assignment this evening that's going to address the idea of why we start to see these color changes in the fall. Yes, the chlorophyll levels start to decrease, but I want you to get from the article why that's happening. Alright, thank you very much.